Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddy Network Podcast. My guest today is Sara Kay Mooney. I heard her present her poetry at an event a month or so ago, and it was a great event because there were people just reading things that they had written, and it was a sublime sort of experience of wow, this is not someone else reading someone else's work. And it wasn't someone giving us speeches. It was reading things that people have been thoughtful about. And so I'm really glad to have you here, Sarah Kay, and thank you. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and particularly what's your connection to poetry.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's really good to be here. Um, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, born and raised in Williamsburg, Virginia, but landed in North Carolina for college. I was an undergraduate student at Davidson, and so I've been in greater Mecklenburg County for my entire adult life, which wasn't necessarily like the full plan, but that's what landed. And so Charlotte is for sure home to me. I live on the east side with my husband and three young kids, ages 9, 7, and 3.
Wow.
Um, and I work outside the home helping manage communications for a global nonprofit. So I work remotely. They're based in Massachusetts, but do work all over the world, but get to tap into some writing and creativity a bit for work. And I feel very blessed to say, quite honestly, that I love my job. But I would say I'm newer to claiming the title of poet. I would long identify myself as a poetry enthusiast, but had to overcome a bit of imposter syndrome, to be quite honest. Honestly, I would say just in the last few months would I feel like
Really?
comfortable kind of leading with that as a part of my identity. Yeah, yeah. So it's been a bit of a journey. And I'm happy to share more about kind of some of the more seminal points that brought me to that. But I've always been an avid reader, ever since I was a young child, but never really gravitated towards poetry as much. As a kid, I would write quite a bit. I'd always keep sort of journals, and there would be kind of sing-songy type poems in a few of them from when I was, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years old. But I never took a poetry class in college. I was an English major, and we'd touch on poetry in some of the required survey courses, but I never sought that out. I never opted into it. For me, poetry always felt a little bit hard to understand, felt a little pretentious, often a little cynical, and I think, struggled to kind of understand a lot of the poems that we'd read for class. And so I was kind of like, that's not like I can respect it from afar, but like that's not my thing. Um, I had a couple moments though that began to sort of change my perspective and made me gravitate towards it a bit more. Um, just as a reader, not even like a poetry writer, but as a reader. And one of those was summer before my junior year at Davidson. I was working at a summer camp program on campus, and went to a poetry reading by at the time Professor Emeritus, Dr. Anthony Abbott. And he is sadly now deceased, but a very talented poet himself. And he shared about his sort of late in the game entry into poetry. And he had a daughter who passed away very suddenly at age 4 and began to use poetry as a way to process his grief. And his story was so moving, and I found his poetry extremely accessible, in a way that prompted me to buy one of his collections. And I was like, oh, maybe I do like poetry. And then about a year or two later, I was gifted a collection of Mary L. Priest, and that was sort of another gateway of sorts. And I just eventually, gradually began to read more. And over time, I think that honestly kind of grew into a bit of an obsession. I found myself reading more and more of it. As I honestly went through some challenging life circumstances, I found it perhaps similar to Dr. Abbott, just as a helpful tool to kind of process grief and trauma and different things.
Hmm.
That I needed to make sense of in my own life. And that eventually led to me doing some writing of it. So here we are.
I imagine that there are a lot of people who follow the similar path. I mean, yours is similar to mine. I went to USC Chapel Hill, and I was American Studies major, and I had some English courses, and there was some poetry in some of those early courses, and I mean, it was, there was one that was constantly talked about within my circle, and it was William Carlos Williams
Mhm.
poem called The Red Wheelbarrow. And it goes like this: so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain beside the white chickens.
Yes.
That's, I think it's famous. I don't know
Yes.
why it's famous. I don't know what it means, but the fact that I can remember that 50 years later says something. What does it say? I don't know what it says. I don't know even what it means. But you see, that was kind of an entry for me, entry point.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
and
I,
it
I think
and it was for fun. It was an entry point of humor and laughter, of
Mhm.
ridiculousness.
Absolutely. And I think that poem, and I am familiar with that poem, for me stands out as one of like an invitation to pay attention. And that I think is a big theme that's emerged for me as a poetry reader. And the more poetry I read, the more I find myself paying attention to just details in the daily life. I think it does help me um, stay a little more grounded, a little more present. I would say I also appreciate, I love William Carlos Williams' work largely because he packs so much into these little very efficient short. I mean, there it was, what, just a couple words, short vignettes. And as a mom of three with a fairly demanding job outside the home, I don't have a ton of time to dive into like 800-page novels in the way I might have when I was 21. But I can sit down and have a good reading of a good poem in between, when I'm waiting in line at daycare pickup. Um, and so I appreciate the efficiency poetry offers too. So for me, there's also that practical element of it, if I'm being fully honest. I, yeah, it allows, to be able to enter into a whole world and engage in a really important piece of literature, um, in a way that's going to be a little more, quite honestly, like I hate to use this word, but more convenient than if I were to sit down and, read a huge work by Tolkien, right?
Well, it I think it is a mirror of the way we think. And I mean, it's not within reach here, but I carry a little journal around, a notebook. And if you look at it, I'll have two kinds of writing in there. I'll have long um, quotes from books. I'm reading something, I'm going to write the quote out of the book. And then the other is just phrases, words, phrases. And because it's a signal, it captures something in the essence of in those few words, and that carries me to the next thought.
That's right. Yeah, little snippets, little fragments. And you can use those to help make sense of the world of your surroundings. Whether or not it's kind of, a super polished, full, complete thought or sentence. Um, yeah.
I'm in the midst of a what I'm calling a sabbatical, It began at the beginning of the month. And I had been working on a new book that was to be the follow-up to a book that I published in 2018. And I came to the point where I realized everything I was saying I'd already said.
Mm.
I abandoned the book.
Wow.
Not only did I abandon the book, I said, I'm not going to write for publication for 3 months. And
Wow.
I'm going to back away from all my social media. And what happened there, well, so one of the things I did in response to that was I took all my journals going back to um, probably 2000, late 1990s, and began to read through them and
Mm.
realize how consistent my thoughts had been over all these years. And
Mm.
it was really helpful and it kind of coalesced a lot of stuff. Okay, now this is who I am and this is what I was thinking. But it was like it's kind of a collection of random things that actually is kind of reflective of poetry.
Yeah, sure. So has rereading some of those old entries made you feel inspired to write any poetry or not
Yes,
quite?
yes. I woke up in the middle of the night last week, and this is the night after I had interviewed Kevin Latour, who will he's a guest. He's a guest on the podcast. He'll appear before you is, so people will know who he is. And I woke
Mhm.
up in the middle of the night, and I had this image in my mind, and image the image was of I had that evening I had watched the first episode of the 90s TV show ER.
Oh.
If you're familiar with that show, and
Hmm.
it's filled with chaos. I mean, I don't know how they filmed that because there is so many moving bodies and moving parts and moving storyline. It's a 90-minute episode. And I was just overwhelmed by it. And I woke up in the middle of the night and I had to write this thing. Now I'm not ready to share it with the world, but the idea is I'm sitting in an office and I hear noise outside and I go to the door and I see chaos.
Mm.
And that
Mm.
chaos is not it may be the chaos of a hospital or emergency room, but it's actually the chaos of the world that I see. So what do I do with that?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on an important point there of why, I mean, it's hard to know how much of this is just I'm in my own world and it's in my own sort of circles and perspective. But
But
I have many
that's valid.
friends.
It's valid.
Sure, sure. I'll speak from my
Yeah,
vantage point.
yeah.
A lot of my friends, and I think COVID played into this for sure. I think a lot of um the tumultuous news cycles that we're seeing, and we have been seeing over the last couple of years. Um, I think a lot of, and I think it might be the season of life I'm in too. I'm late 30s. You know, a lot of my friends have children. We're hitting middle age. Um, our parents, we're starting to see our parents, our friends' parents pass away. And so, we're just entering this new phase of life a bit. But I'm seeing a lot of my friends who've like, I've never read poetry, but they're just gravitating towards it. And they're saying, can you recommend a poet? Can you, where should I start? What collection should I read first? I want to get a book. Like, I don't know where to go. Um, and I'm seeing, yeah, a lot of friends just kind of gravitate towards it. And like you said, when we see chaos, we need a space to process. We need a space to make sense of it. And if anything, we need a space just to acknowledge what's going on. And I think poetry can offer that in a way that like just, nonfiction writing doesn't always offer. And I started a poetry Instagram account. Gosh, I think it was January of 2020. Um,
Mhm.
where it was a personal goal of mine that year, sort of a New Year's resolution. Like I want to be more intentional in reading more poetry. And so I was like, I'm just going to post some of the poems I read. I'm going to post them, maybe do this in community with others. That was such a lifeline because, of course, 2 months later was when we entered into lockdown. And that was a really helpful outlet for me to have. And I think I'd see other people kind of enter the fold and chime in and engage with these different poems in a way that was certainly really meaningful to me, in a way that was meaningful to the poets themselves. Um, as sometimes they would chime in or they would reshare, they would say, "Thank you for sharing this." And I've appreciated just, the opportunities that, and certainly I've sought them out, but to read poetry in community too. It doesn't have to be this kind of isolating event. And like you mentioned, the event we were at last month, right? That was in community. Um, and I think poetry is, an easy thing to share with others too.
And you write about that on your website, that it's poetry is for being in community, and I like that. So there's so many rabbit trails to go down here. What do you see? So let me ask you this question. Coming out of COVID, did you see that the sense of what community is changed in people's minds? And if so, what is that? What is that sense of community now that people are grasping? I mean, I had this conversation this morning,
Yeah.
email with one of my friends in the UK. So this is really fresh and real.
Sure. Are you thinking with kind of the context of poetry specifically, or just broadly speaking?
More broadly, because I think
Yeah.
the poetry was the vehicle for getting into the community.
Mm-hmm. 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 Sure. Man, well, with COVID, I had just two children at the time, and ages 2 and 4, and was still working the best I could while watching them, because my husband was an essential worker, and he was at the time working at a retirement community, and so we were very cautious. Um, Given the high stakes of, potential exposure to his clientele. Um, but he was also going to work every day. And so, man, we were very isolated during those first few months, for several months, honestly. And um, I found myself, even though I am an introvert, my eldest child is very extroverted. Um, and so we had to kind of get creative, and it made me appreciate, certainly, the community I find in my neighborhood, in a really deep way. And I think that sort of, at the time, we had been living in our home for about 5 years at that point, and we knew a lot of our neighbors, but um, that sort of expedited our relationships a bit into a much deeper, like, checking in, and sort of, okay, like, the level where, like, you're my emergency contact now, and vice versa. Um, and I'm so grateful to have good neighbors. So I think of, like, that immediate, like, our worlds got so small sort of geographically. At the same time, though, there was this digital expansion. And for me, that took place in the form of work. And so just sort of, that was when I started working remotely, and I've been working remotely ever since. Um, and we also had, different traditions of, like, reconnecting with my group of college roommates once a week over Zoom, and reconnecting with some friends from high school over Zoom. And we set up a family Zoom. And so, my world also got bigger in that sense, um, as well. But I think when it comes to, I can't not look back at COVID without that lens of, like, parenting, and just seeing that, like, intense need to not parent in physical isolation. It's really, really challenging to do. And that was a time, playgrounds were closed. And I'm grateful to, like, that we live in a place with a backyard, and again, just good neighbors and other playmates on our actual street who we
Do
could
you
do
you see
life alongside.
this? Do you see this level of community that emerged from the pandemic? Do you see
Mhm.
it as sustainable?
The with my neighbors, yes, in my experience, yes. And that again sort of expedited like this level of intimacy in a way I'm so grateful for and in a way that has sustained. Even though, now we're what, 5 years out. Um, and so that hasn't gone away. I think all the Zoom calls that didn't fully feel sustainable once the world sort of reopened, so to speak. Um, but I do think um, yeah, I think for me, if anything, it was just like a gut check on not taking things for granted. I think about my like faith community and how hard it was to not be physically present for communal worship in that regard and how much I missed that. At the time, I was reading a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's about um, processing racism, but through a really like embodied lens. And he's a therapist who studied under gosh, I'm gonna ruin the name, but the gentleman who wrote a well-known book called The Body Keeps the Score.
It's about trauma. Yeah.
Yeah, and in this, which is not written from a faith lens, he talks a lot about like communal acts and embodied acts that help process trauma, and it could be like singing in a group or clapping. He said like washing each other's feet as one, and it's like, gosh, well, no wonder I really missed our Maundy Thursday service. And like I realized like at a time when I'm needing these like communal, like he just talked about the power of being in a circle and again, like singing or holding hands and all of those elements as a way to process trauma and at a season that felt fairly traumatic and certainly taxing to say the least. I didn't have that outlet that I would typically have. And so that's another thing looking back of like, gosh, that was something that was really challenging. And I feel really grateful to have the opportunity to be back in person with my church family.
I really agree with you. And what I see is that we're catching up with where many people in the philosophic world were mid-century, 20th century, you know, where embodiment was important then.
Mhm.
But what I see is that we've been moving out of thinking as the way we define ourselves and the way we interact with people. And but if we're talking about communities of faith, we this is what I believe. This is who God is. This is who Jesus is. This is my faith statement, and that becomes how I define myself. But I think we're shifted over to how do I experience this? What is the experience of faith? And I think this is where poetry becomes really valuable because the poetry allows that intuitive side of us to have some articulation that describes, oh, this is what I'm experiencing, and and then that can be shared with people.
That's exactly right. And one of a longstanding tradition I've held for, gosh, I think it's about a decade and a half now, is to email out a poem to family and friends each week during the Christian liturgical seasons of Advent and Lent. And it started with a handful, I mean, a dozen family and friends. And I just sent out a little email and eventually started writing a brief reflection attached to it. And this was sort of just a focusing discipline for me during what are typically pretty busy seasons, increasingly so once kids entered the scene. And the poems I would share aren't necessarily explicitly Christian or explicitly written by even people who would identify as someone of faith. Um, but they're poems that I've found that kind of, are on theme with the season or something that I feel like I'm learning or wrestling through as it relates to my faith. And so it's just been a helpful sort of again processing discipline and a real grounding opportunity. But that community piece of it has been really rich too. And so, family and friend like they would be like, can I share this with other people? And so the list sort of grew over time and um anyone is welcome. I'll say that here. Anyone who's watching this is welcome to join. And I've shifted that platform to Substack just to make it a little more accessible for folks. Um, but people like they'll respond, they'll weigh in, they'll say, "Oh, I noticed this," or "I actually didn't really like this poem, and here's why," or like, "I appreciated your reflection on that." And what I love about this tradition is many people who subscribe to this are friends of mine who aren't people of faith. And I have one friend who's like, I don't believe God is real, but like I love the poems you share, and so I'm going to keep signing up for this. I have other friends who are like, I don't like poetry, but I like the poems you share. And so it's kind of a cool, like different circles, different paths crossing. And for some people, the entry point might be faith. For others, the entry point might be the poem. For others, it might just be like, well, you're my friend, and I want to read what you have to say. But it's been kind of a neat little community that's grown, and a practice that I treasure. And I always say, like, the day this becomes a chore, I'm not going to do it. Um, and it hasn't yet. So keeping it up.
Do you have a process that you follow to write some poetry? But can you describe that for us?
Yes. And one of my goals this year was to be a little more disciplined in stewarding that. And that for me meant carving out a very specific time of the week to dedicate to writing. Um, Prior to doing that and kind of literally putting it on the calendar and coordinating with my husband of like, all right, this is like my time and I'm gonna leave the house and do this. Focused, uninterrupted time, which for me is Sunday mornings. And that's worked well. Prior to that, it was much more haphazard and very much like a thought, kind of similar to you. But like I'm at a red light, a thought just came to me. I'm gonna punch it out in the notes app on my phone. Or I am I find I do a lot of writing during church on Sunday mornings as well. So I'll just kind of have my notebook ready and just write different thoughts. And then now I'm more in the habit of using that dedicated writing time on Sundays before church, where I'll go back and I'll revisit some of those things and see like, is there something here? And maybe if I feel like there is, I'll type it up. And so kind of have an ongoing Google Doc of just sort of miscellaneous poems that I'm working, reworking, revisiting, revising. So that's about, it's not particularly scientific, but I found that's worked pretty well for me.
Do you have people that you share the poems with before you ever publish them?
My two older sisters, and they are not poets themselves. They are, I would say they're not, I don't know if either would either even identify as a poetry enthusiast, as I have for many years. Um, but I know they'll be honest with me. And I think they're a good gauge of like, yeah, this isn't making any sense. So I kind of like having a sounding board from folks who maybe aren't as proximate to kind of the poetry world. I think that keeps me honest in a way. But I actually am 2 weeks into an online virtual poetry class that has a workshop component. So that's new and has been really, really helpful and fruitful, I think, in sort of developing my craft in a way that I hadn't had that formal structure. I think that was a piece that kept me from owning that title as poet, was that I had no formal training. And I felt like, again, like I have done a lot of reading. I could tell you a lot about kind of American Lit, because that was a lot of the classes I took, but not so much on poetry. And I'm like, I don't know if my poems are even good, so to speak. So I had to kind of get through some of that, and move beyond a bit of that. I think another piece that helped me again in my journey to sort of claiming the identity as poet was um, the chance I had to meet the author Cole Arthur Riley about a year ago at a book signing in Charlotte in a reading. And we had connected online a bit, just on Instagram, where she's very kind of active and present in running the account Black Liturgies. Um, but just sort of bonded over poems. And she often shares poetry that she's reading as well. And so it was a great honor to meet her in person. And we were chatting about poetry and what she wrote. And she asked, "Are you a poet?" And I said, "Well, no." I kind of, wobbled back and forth. And she wrote in my book, like, "If I'm a poet, you're a poet. Call yourself by your name." And I was like, okay, if Cole Arthur Riley's telling me to own it, like I just need to get over myself and own it. And so that was like, for lack of a better term, sort of the permission I needed a bit. So
I,
I
I,
needed to
I
get
think
over myself.
a lot of people come face to face with that facet of their life where there's something that emerges that defines them, and but they do not feel like they're the expert yet, or if
Yeah,
they ever will. And you used the term early in this conversation about being a fraud or a
yeah,
what's the
imposter.
imposter. One of my guests I've had on here came on and before we hardly even got in, she said that she had heard this woman talking about imposter syndrome, and her and she said, if you're not feeling an imposter, then you're not trying hard enough. And I just thought, oh, that's just fantastic. That's so true.
Exactly. Yes, that resonates. hmm
Um, would you be willing to read us one of your poems?
I'd love to. Yeah. Um, I will read one. Um, I'll read one that I shared at the event we were at. And this is a poem I wrote several years ago during a challenging season of life. And in this season, I was reading through very slowly, very intentionally, the book of Proverbs. I just felt really desperate for wisdom. And so that was what I was doing. And as I was reading, I was maybe similar to you, kind of pulling out little clips and fragments of things that phrases, words that in my readings just sort of resonated. Um, and eventually, as I was revisiting some of those sort of notebook entries, I felt this poem that kind of just like tumbled out of me. This was one that was like, this was it. I didn't even do many edits to it. Um, and this is called The Way You Grow Old, and it is a bit of an anti-proverb. So I think for me, it was like, it's helpful. I'm a former teacher. It's helpful to kind of have examples and then also non-examples. Um, and so this is sort of a product of me sort of wrestling through some of the key takeaways from reading Proverbs. So this is The Way You Grow Old. And this was published by Fathom magazine several years ago.
Great.
First, make long lists of what you do not have. Do whatever it takes to get it. Second, hurry up. Tell your children to hurry up again and again and again. But really, let your children do as they please, whenever they please. Meanwhile, slog and grind some more so you can buy all those things. Then, when injustice sweeps away the fruit from the fields of the poor, say nothing. Also, befriend the truculent, learn their ways. When entangled, shout louder. Next, dwell on disputes. Answer first, then listen. Have no mind to understand. And finally, add fields to field to field to field until there is room for no one but you. And when the dry grass sinks down in the flame, thrusting us all into the thick darkness, remind yourself that though you make many prayers, he will not listen.
Wow. That is that is so good. That is so good. I mean, I'm in my 70s and thinking about old age. which it comes first to your body, and then everything else goes. But in thinking about that, all those things you say is the opposite of what we should be doing.
Mhm.
Taking time to be with one another, and that's the challenge. That's really the challenge that we all have. Now, I'm planning to live past 100, so I'm not at the end yet. I'm just in the third
Right.
third half of my life.
There
So,
you go.
but I think having that mindset that okay, I'm not going to grow old delicately. I'm just going to keep growing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think for at least in my demographic, there is such a obsession with looking young and like the amount of ads that I get targeted on, this super
Right.
expensive face cream or Botox this and everyone's, what's your skincare regimen? And like the amount of money that is poured into that industry is like absolutely outrageous in my opinion. Um, and so there's so much obsession with like how do we look young? How do we stay fit? But like not a lot when it comes to spiritual fitness and like how like how are we keeping our spirits, our souls sort of
Right.
young and healthy and fit. And so I would say if there's any sort of takeaway from the book of Proverbs, it's that like, we have to kind of shift perspectives from the way the world approaches it.
It reminds me of the beginning verses in Ecclesiastes 3, which there's a time to be born, a time to die. But the paragraph that follows that is even more striking. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Let me see if I can quickly find it, because what
Hmm.
what it um what it says is something that is I think much more um, let's see if I can even spell this. Sorry. Um, it's about how we live. And okay, and let's go there. Okay, so let me just read I think it's the first 10 verses. Yes. And and I think this would be the, I don't know, it's not the antidote, but let me just read this. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He's made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done this so that all should stand in awe before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already is, and God seeks out that which is gone by.
Hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I love how much of scripture is poetry. And I think that that is in my own sort of Christian upbringing and training, I wasn't that as like a genre. I wasn't um, sort of trained in how to like approach the poems in scripture and maybe approach it differently from say one of Paul's letters, though he breaks into poetry too on occasion. Um, and I think now that I've read much more poetry, now that I've been studying it a bit more intentionally and writing it, I hear something like that with sort of new ears, and have certainly a deeper appreciation for that.
I don't know if you knew this, but I'm a retired Presbyterian minister, and I have most of what I've done ministry wise in the last 15 years has been a lot of it has been doing funerals, memorial
Mm,
services for people.
yeah.
A lot of them in my family, and I use that text in all of those because I want people not to feel like it's the end. It's simply a passage through time into the next time, and I think that's a way that poetry can provide us a way to kind of, I'm gonna say it very specifically, thing time. So time is not a thing. It's not the watch. It's not the clock. It's not the calendar. It's not the schedule. Time is this thing that we're all kind of immersed in, and um,
Mhm.
and
It's comforting to know. I would say that those words, though written thousands of years ago, still hold such relevance. There is a comfort to that of like, okay, this, and I know Ecclesiastes also has quite a bit, around, there's that resounding phrase of like, nothing is new under the sun.
yeah,
And I think that could be read as like, well, that feels a little dire, a little cynical. But for me, it's comforting to know like, okay, humanity has like been through a lot through the ages, and there's still that steadiness of the presence of God. Um, and though different, leaders come and go and different seasons come and go, there is, some things remain unchanged, and the earth is still here, and humanity's still here. And yeah, I think something about just the age of that text is brings quite a comfort.
yeah, and I think it fits really well with your poem
Mm,
because in a sense, your poem is an advocation of that last section of, which is go live your life, enjoy it, be happy, eat, drink, and be merry. I mean, for all of that which we will do, well, it'll come to end, but it'll also be something fulfilling, and we don't
hmm
have to worry about it. I think that's
hmm
that's what I take away from that, and I see that in your poem, and it's really. I remember you reading that night. I thought, this is really good. So thank you. Thank you. Um, so how do people find you?
Yeah, probably the best way is to go to my website, just which is sarakaymooney.com. And from there, I share a couple publications that I've put out into the world. And I do have intentions to try to keep that relatively updated as I do a little more writing. Um, and there's also an opportunity to join that Lent poetry series as well, just through the website. And so would love for anyone to pop on. We're a couple of weeks in, of course, but would be great to just bring more folks into the fold if you're interested in reading good poems. And then I do still share poems pretty regularly on Instagram, and that is at SKM Reads Poetry.
Um, how often are you invited to come read publicly? Is that something new or?
It's new. Yes, it's new. And it's something I'm again trying to say yes to, even if it is outside my comfort zone. Um, And I, I guess in the last year, I've read maybe last year and a half, probably four times. So it's very new to me, but I appreciate the opportunities to do that and certainly to share my work here now. So thank you.
Well, you're very good at it. And I think the quality is not just in the performance, but it's actually in the words that you are
Mm,
saying. I think that's what grabs people, and I think it's really quite good.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Uh, one more question for you. I know that you were working in the educational world. I know that you're a former school librarian,
Mhm.
and so I'm curious about how you view the world of education as it is unfolding into the future, and what sort of place does poetry have in that world, if it has any place, and what are your thoughts?
That's a great question. And I think, sadly, so much of what teachers have time to teach is dictated by the curriculum and the state standards, which of course are aligned to most often standardized testing, which is a landscape that is, there's ebbs and flows and shifts and evolutions that are happening right now. Um, but um, I think poetry is often deprioritized. And I think a lot of what, I have two school-age children. They have not studied poetry formally quite yet. I tried to integrate it into like nighttime readings and things with them. Um, but yeah, gosh, I would love to see more of it in schools. There was an opportunity that I had to collaborate with one of our language arts teachers when I was the school librarian at a local middle school here in Charlotte, public middle school. And we brought in, she kind of got a grant and brought in a poet to do sort of a workshop with the students. And this is a group of students who had seen, even in their young age, a lot of adversity in their lives, and many of whom have lived their entire lives living below sort of the poverty line. And poetry was such an incredible outlet, and the poems that these kids were producing were absolutely astounding. Um, and I would just, gosh, I would love to like see that made like a required thing for every seventh grader, right? To do a massive poetry unit or workshop. Um,
Yeah.
but certainly applaud those teachers who are doing what they can to bring that in and get children exposed to opportunities to write and help them find their voice at a young age. I think that's really important. And you'll hear a lot of poets speak to, I think specifically of Clint Smith, who's an amazing poet, and he always credits sort of his second grade teacher as like Miss Brown or whatever her name was, as like really being such a huge force in him
Yeah.
entering into his poet self and author self. So it starts early.
I credit my love for words to my fourth grade teacher, Millie Brown,
Mhm.
because she kept me after school 2 or 3 days a week, all year.
Yeah,
I wasn't a bad kid. I was just, active and
sure.
I, and she, okay, I'm keeping you after school for 45 minutes. And what she made me do was copy pages out of the elementary school dictionary.
Mhm. Yeah.
I can see myself sitting in that classroom right now, and I got to spend some time with her 18 years later,
Mm.
and and was able to say thank you to her.
Yeah. Yeah. What a formative age, right? And
Yeah.
this is a good prompt and push for me to think which teachers should I kind of go back to and say that thanks. And so I hope folks who are listening will take that on too.
So now, as a mom, how do you how do you take poetry to your children? And I know they're young, but so you can't talk about it in as this category of,
Hmm.
but you can certainly talk to them in a poetic way. And
Yeah, I remember my son who's very mathematically minded. And also an avid reader, but like loves math, loves numbers, very like sort of logic driven. And there's certainly a world of math within certain forms of poetry, especially when you're looking at, you know, rhythm and pentameter and some of those things. I gravitate more towards sort of free verse myself and what I read and how I write. Um, but I'm actually working on a poem called like I don't, it's a very much a work in progress and it might not ever see the light of day, but like it was like attempting to explain poetry to my math obsessed son or something like that, like my 7-year-old math obsessed son. Um, and I struggled when he asked me like, what is poetry? I kind of struggled and I found myself actually like the best way to explain it to him was to show him poems. And there's a great children's book called, I think, Daniel Finds a Poem. And it's about a little boy who's very curious and he's kind of engaging with nature and on a walk in the park and has these different encounters throughout the day. And he's trying to understand what a poem is. And is, again, for this work, it's kind of that like leans into that sense of like poetry as a way to pay attention to the world around you. Um, so that's a book I recommend to any parents who are attempting to explain it to their kids. But it's ongoing, it's ongoing. I think even my own understanding of what poetry is ever evolving too. And the more I read it, the more um, it might take a new meaning or a new understanding.
yeah, I mean, it occurred to me as you were saying those words just a moment ago that maybe the way to introduce poetry to children is through song, and that
Yes,
lyrics are are essentially poetry that are fit to a rhythm and a tune, and maybe that's a way to get at it. So
absolutely. Hmm. Very
that
true.
well, Sarah Kay, it's been fantastic to have you here, and so encouraged by who you are and what you're doing with your creative output, your poetry, and the influence you're going to have on people, and the influence you're going to have on people who you'll never know, but because you're out there doing this, you're out there giving your sense of would it be fair to say there's a calling here?
I think so. Maybe ministry. Yeah, certainly. Yes. And it's simple and it's straightforward and just, sharing poems and not even ones that I write. I think it's a ministry. I see it that way. So I appreciate you identifying it as such too.
Well, I wish
Um,
you well. I wish you well as you go forward, and I look forward to staying in touch with you, and
yes.
we'll see where all the Eddy Network poets list, how that emerges, and who knows, maybe we'll all gather as the world poetry, Eddy Network Poets World
I love it.
Conference or something. Who knows what will.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity and just for, yeah, all the work you're doing to steward all sorts of voices and creative folks. And yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you, and thank you everyone for watching. And hey, keep a notebook by your hand and keep writing, keep writing. Don't stop because you never know what will result from it. And if you want to share it, send it to me. I'll be glad to read it, and I will give you an honest but positive and affirming opinion about it. So, so thank you again, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddy Network Podcast. Bye bye.